Hello, this is Nick Zararis of the Liberty Blue podcast. About 5 minutes ago, Larry Brooks reported that Chris Kreider was agreeing to waive his no trade clause and agreeing to go to the Anaheim Ducks as part of understanding this and contextualizing this. And I've been working on something for my Substack since these rumors were reported on Tuesday night, the what it means, because there's a lot to unpack here. And I'm not going to go on and on because I think I can do a better job writing it, but I did want to get some thoughts out there and effectively use this as a means of workshopping some of my ideas because there's so much to be said about Chris Kreider, the hockey player, Chris Kreider, what he means to the Rangers, and a whole lot of that is tied to the near miss. And the Rangers during this Kreider window, which, if you'll recall, if you're on the younger side, you might not remember that debut against the Senators back in 2012. But that Rangers team under John Tortorella was making small steps. They had a great regular season that year. They were one of the better teams in the NHL. Didn't score a whole lot, but they had a former first round pick in Kreider who jumped immediately from Boston College to the NHL. He scored a goal in that first game against Ottawa. I can still vividly close my eyes and picture the sight of him after scoring down on his knees in the corner, pushing himself back up to his knees and two teammates coming over and giving him pats on the head. And ever since, Kreider has presented a tantalizing and at times frustrating toolbox. And some people don't recall that it took him the better part of two NHL seasons to really firmly establish himself as a regular. That 12-13 season is kind of hard to properly evaluate because Tortorella was very much burning his way through that room. That was his fourth season as the coach. Only 48 regular season games. The season didn't start till like January, February. And it was hard for him to build any real momentum for himself. Of course, he scores that one overtime game winner in the second round against the Bruins in 2013 to make the Rangers not get swept. I believe that was game 4 to force a game 5, which the Rangers did end up losing. But the following year, he really starts to get his feet under him. 2013, 2014, the year the Rangers win the Stanley Cup, go to the Stanley Cup, excuse me. God, if only they had won the Stanley Cup, this would be a very different episode right now. But they go to the Stanley Cup final in 2013, 2014, if you'll recall, of course. Alain Vigneault was the Canucks coach. John Tortorella was the Rangers coach. They switched jobs that offseason. Tortorella went to Vancouver, and when the Canucks came to MSG that year, the Rangers, Chris Kreider scored a hat trick in that game. If you'll recall, he suffered that really bad shoulder injury where it was a weird hit against the boards. If I remember correctly, his arm like went into the camera hole and dislocated his shoulder. He ultimately comes back in that second round series against Pittsburgh, the one where the Rangers come back from that 3-1 deficit, ultimately win that series. They go to the Montreal series. Of course, if you're a Canadiens fan, you curse the name Chris Kreider. If you're a Canadiens fan watching the stream, you're probably poking a voodoo doll of Chris Kreider. But as we all know, Alexei Emelin tripped him. And there was nothing could he have maybe diverted his body a little bit and not gone in as full speed? Yeah, but he's going full speed. A little hard to expect a grown man to stop the way he's going. It's the conversation we have in football all the time about defensive players going over the middle. And when you have that happen, it creates a really fierce tribal line. And I don't think Kreider's a dirty player. I don't think that was intentional, but alas. And then something weird happens. Kreider originally shows up in that 2012 season as not like the finishing touch on that core of Derek Stepan, Ryan Callahan, Dubinsky, Anisimov. Of course, they traded Anisimov and Dubinsky for Rick Nash. Rick Nash, Chris Kreider, Derek Stepan. They still have Brad Richards. And that's really your baseline. Girardi, Stahl, McDonough, Strawman still there, Lundqvist, of course. And that's really your core. And you get two really good kicks at the can in 2013-14, which I wouldn't say was out of nowhere, but definitely a little bit unexpected. I can honestly say I don't think I expected them to beat the Penguins, if I remember correctly. Of course, that was like 11 years ago at this point, so if my memory escapes me, forgive me. But I don't feel like I felt they were going to beat that Penguins team very much in the midst of Crosby, Malkin at the peaks of their respective powers. Fleury's still an upper echelon goalie, but they pull that off. They get to the Cup final. They lose 3 games in overtime out of 5, 2 of them in double overtime. Of course, game 5 being in double overtime as well, something that NBC refused, NBC, TNT, basically all of the networks refused to let escape us, even though it's one of the most miserable and haunting experiences of my entire life. Then from there, 14-15, that was the year to make it happen with that core. And of course, things evolve. You have Rick Nash in there instead of Dubinsky and Anisimov. You bring in Marty St. Louis. You drop Strawman. You bring in Dan Boyle. And that 15 team is the last real kick at the can, because after that, you trade Hagelin, you trade Cam Talbot, and you start to have to subtract to meet up salary demands. And 15-16, they lose in 5 to the Penguins. They have an opportunity there to reset, and they don't. They do trade for Mika Zibanejad that summer, Brassard for Mika Zibanejad, and Zibanejad comes in that first season. They run him, Stepan, and Kevin Hayes down the middle. Kreider's firmly in there. Of course, during this pocket, we all kind of know they're not good enough to win the Stanley Cup, but they're a playoff team. They probably should have beat the Senators in 2017. They wouldn't have beat the Penguins, most likely, but they could have at least gave the Penguins a series. Of course, the Senators took the Penguins to Game 7 overtime and won ultimately on a Chris Kunitz goal of all people. But after that, things really change. And I can still vividly remember that day in, I think it was 2019. It might have been 2020. It was one of those 2 years where Kreider was the pending unrestricted free agent. And at the trade deadline, there was a lot of conjecture. What were the Rangers going to do? Because they were firmly in a rebuild, a multi-year rebuild at that point. And instead, they opted to give him a multi-year extension, the one that he's currently on. And I personally, at the time, felt, well, if we're rebuilding, why are we keeping him? And of course, that's an unpopular opinion. It's been an unpopular opinion. I'm very well aware the status Chris Kreider holds amongst Ranger fans, in particular Ranger fans of my generation, as being one of the team's better players, their best goal scorer for basically, I would say 12 of the 13, 14 years he's been on the team. He's been their best goal scorer. And that's probably a bit of hyperbole. I'd say at least 7 or 8 of the 12 years he was a Ranger, he was the best goal scorer on the team. And Kreider was on the team so long that he was seen as the final piece of a group of prospects in establishing a core. That core burned out. They had to rebuild. He stayed. They got back to contender status. They burned out again. And now he's an old guard. You know, he's a member of what was, and frankly, he's the last real connection to that Henrik Lundqvist era. You look around at the guys on this team, not a whole lot of guys with connections to those early 2010s teams. Adam Fox was here in 2019. He played with Hank, but that's very sparing. Panarin was on that team as well. Very sparing. Zibanejad, very sparing. But none of those guys were directly on those 14-15 teams that came so tantalizingly close. And I think Kreider's a fascinating case and a really interesting player because at face value, a guy at his size, 6'3", 220, 225, who can skate the way he does, should be one of the most dominant players in the entire NHL. And we only saw scratches of that. We only saw that in bursts and flashes. And it's a real difficult way to evaluate things. And I think this is largely what I've struggled with in what I'm writing for my Substack about Kreider. And I would love to hear thoughts. So by all means, if you're on the stream, drop them in the chat. How do you contextualize a player who never won any individual awards, never won a Stanley Cup, was never the best player on his own team, but was here for a long time? He's in the top 5 or 10 of most important franchise statistical categories. He's top 3 or 4 in most of the playoff statistical categories. How do you properly contextualize that against your feelings and your emotions? Because, and this is the great debate of sports in the 21st century that's largely been LeBron and Skip Bayless influenced, but if you don't win a championship, what can you take away from that? And most teams, of course, don't win. Regardless of your sport, only one team's going to win the championship at the end of the season. So do all of those other 30 teams, 31 teams in the NHL's case, do those teams Did their season not matter at all? Did the feelings you experienced, do the memories you made, do they not count? It's does the tree fall in the forest and no one's around to hear it? Doesn't make a noise. That's kind of how you have to contextualize this. And ultimately, this, like most things in life, is going to be what you make of it and what you feel. Because I struggle. I don't have a definitive answer. I think about the hat trick against the Hurricanes. I think about him coming back from the blood clot. I think about all of the times he was candid and really went to bat for guys on this team who were struggling. I will always think about the goal he scored. And they lost this game, but I will always think about the goal he scored game 4, 2014 against Montreal. No, game 3, excuse me, against Montreal in 2014, where 10 seconds left or so, he redirects a puck in, they score, they force overtime, because the reaction he had, the celebration he did after he scored was the most vigorous and most, frankly, like colorful celebration anybody on the Rangers had done at any point, like in my life at that point. And sitting here now as a 28-year-old who remembers Chris Kreider debuting when they were in high school, I don't want to say the last 12 years didn't mean anything. I don't want to say that all of the memories, the goals, the assists, the personal stuff, that matters. And interpreting that and contextualizing that against a culture which is so championship driven, and it only matters if you win. If you're not winning, it doesn't matter. And I have to personally reconcile that. That is something that I, as a media person and as a sports fan, is a constant back and forth, because I have largely, over the last 2 or 3 years in particular, part of the animus for why I've been so dismissive of this general manager and his worldview and his outlook on the team is because he has operated like the Rangers are Stanley Cup contenders. They're Stanley Cup or bust. If we don't win a championship, it is a failure. So if the general manager is operating from that principle, yet not really changing a whole lot, what is that doing? It's creating a disconnect. And it's why I personally have come around a little bit more on where I don't want to call this window, which frankly, and I was talking about this yesterday on Twitter, arguably the most successful window in the history of the New York Rangers franchise, 2012 to 2024. You're talking about several conference finals appearance, only one Stanley Cup final appearance, of course. The second most playoff wins of any team in the 2010s to not win the Stanley Cup, behind the Sharks. You're talking about a team that really only had one future Hall of Famer in Henrik Lundqvist. Yes, Marty St. Louis went to the Hockey Hall of Fame, but he was only on the Rangers for 2 of those seasons. And even if you want to talk about the present day Rangers, 2021 to the present, where you talk about the first year Drury took over, they go to the conference final against Tampa Bay. Maybe Panarin as the best undrafted player of all time, other than Wayne Gretzky. Maybe he's a Hall of Famer, and that doesn't even get into the moral clause of it all. Maybe Shesterkin if he keeps this going. Maybe Adam Fox if he keeps this going. But Chris Kreider is very emblematic of the Rangers' macro level issues. Chris Kreider is a very good hockey player. I don't think anyone is going to dispute that he's been very good. 54 goal, led the league in power play goals in 2021, 2022. I think is like top 8 or 9 in the NHL in goals scored since 2018. I'm going to look that up on StatMuse right now. NHL leading goal scorer since, let's do 2019. So Matthews, Draisaitl, Pasta. Where's Kreider? Is Kreider 17? So 17th most goals since 2018, 2019, largely buoyed by that 54 goal season. So let's do it since 2021 out of curiosity and see if he cracks the top. Yeah, he's 14th in goals since the start of the 2021 season, which was the 56 game division locked season. So never the best in the world. Maybe the best power play guy in the league for a 2 or 3 year window there. But other than that, never the best player on his own team. Would on any other team be considered the second line left wing behind Panarin, but because of the way the Rangers have deployed their lineup during this window, they've been on separate lines, and Kreider's gotten a little bit more of a preferential role because they want Zibanejad doing certain things. Whatever. It doesn't really matter. But I don't know what the right answer is here as far as contextualizing Kreider's NHL career, because the toolbox to be a truly transcendent player is still there. You know the flashes of speed, the penalty kills, the shorthanded stuff. You know the net front stuff. All of the tools to be a really special hockey player were there. And he didn't really get to that higher level until he was 30. That's the other crazy part of this conversation is that Chris Kreider arguably peaked as an NHLer and got to that highest threshold at 30. Most guys, they're going to start to plateau in their mid to late 20s. 26, 27 is generally the best the guy's going to be. Later in their careers, 28, 29, 30, after they sign the big free agent contract, that's when they typically put up their best counting stats. But for Kreider to find that higher plane of not just counting stats, but more efficiency and frankly, just better overall play as a 30-year-old, that's an extreme outlier. That's not something that's particularly common. The only other player in the present day NHL with a similar trajectory is Brock Nelson, who, again, at age 30, reached that 30-goal plateau and really took another step forward. And now Nelson, 35, 40-goal guy a couple times. So contextualizing Kreider is tricky. And I think, and this is going to sound mean, but I mean this well, Kreider is very symbolic of this era of Rangers hockey. A very, very good hockey player. Never great. And I think a lot of these Ranger teams over the last 15 years, at best, have been very good. None of them have ever truly been great. And the Rangers' reticence to move on from guys, to maybe sell high on them, is tied to that idea that they think good enough is enough. And in a cutthroat league where teams are trying to find anywhere on the margins to improve, to see Kreider get traded now at his lowest possible value with 2 years remaining on his contract, and what? You expect me to trust Chris Drury's going to spend that $6 million well? He spent how much on Will Borgen and Urho Vakanainen and Juuso Parssinen, and you expect me to be happy he has more cap space? That's concerning, to say the least. And now, look, you got to replace 25 to 30 goals. That is your impetus if you are Chris Kreider now. If you are Chris Drury now. You traded Chris Kreider. You need to find 25 to 30 goals. Not only do you need to replace Kreider's goals, you need to replace the goals that were the difference between making and missing the playoffs. Some of that will be defensively and better goaltending. You get better defense, better goaltending. You need to score fewer goals. But as the general manager has so repeatedly told us, the goal here is to not make the playoffs. It is to win the Stanley Cup. So the threshold isn't just we concede a few less goals, we replace Kreider's 20 goals, we're back in the playoffs. It's we need to get better defensively. We need to replace Kreider's 25 goals. And then we need another 20 to 30 goals if we want to be in that top 10 range, which is generally where Stanley Cup contenders come from. It's very rare to see what happened a couple years ago where the Florida Panthers, made the Stanley Cup final as the lowest seeded playoff team. That's not something that happens all that often in this format. It is very uncommon for a low seed like that to go the distance. And it took winning 2 games in overtime, in that Bruins series in the first round to get the luck going their way to swing that series. Because if I remember correctly, the Bruins were up, I want to say 3-2 or 3-1. And Matthew Tkachuk, if I remember correctly, scored 2 overtime game winners in that series. But this is a Rangers podcast. We're not talking about the Panthers. I will always be grateful for Kreider's role in, I don't want to say legitimizing, but giving us hope. And I think, like Morgan Freeman says in, I almost said Django Unchained, in the Shawshank Redemption, hope's a dangerous thing. It'll drive you crazy. And there was that little part of you that always felt, well, even if they're on the penalty kill, Kreider and Zibanejad can go the other way. Or I know we're down late, but we get one power play. We're going at 32% right now. We get the power play out there. All we need is a Kreider tip. All we need is a Kreider net front play. And then you have the material part of this. You have the emotional connection that this is a guy who had a serious medical scare in a blood clot that very much could have ended his NHL career and came back from that. You had a guy who's lasted 3 life cycles of a team where he came to a contender, They tore it down. They built it back up. Now he's not going to be here to see if they can build it back up to another contender. But he went through 3 life cycles. That's not something that happens all that often. It is very rare for NHL players to play as many games as Chris Kreider has. I believe he's in the 880s. If all goes well and he doesn't suffer any serious injuries, he should hit that 1,000 game mark in 2 years. But it is very rare. If I remember correctly, it's something like only 0.5% of players reach the 1,000 game threshold. Everyone who's played in the NHL, if I remember correctly, it's 0.5% have made it that far. I'm going to click on the chat and see if anyone has to say anything. Robert says, wish Kreider well. He gave us some truly exciting moments. Hopes he finds his touch with Anaheim. I agree with you. And I'm going to go through the comments as we go here because I do want to make this a little more of a conversation. But I think you want the guy to make, you never want to see anyone struggle. And Kreider going to Anaheim, it's a great opportunity to take a leadership role. And it's a great idea to put up good counting stats. And we saw Frank Vetrano do this a few years ago where he made the all-star team, had like 30, 35 goals. If you're a good player on a bad team, it's great for your numbers. It truly is something special to see happen. And when you're at this stage of your career and you're Chris Kreider, you probably know the chances of winning a Stanley Cup are limited unless he gets traded again, which isn't out of the realm of possibility that the Ducks flip him again. But I do think that's a different conversation for later on. I do too. I hope Kreider does well in Anaheim. He's been a really important player for this franchise. And I'll wrap up talking about whether they should retire his number or not. And Vitali21 says, going to miss Kreider a ton. He was my first jersey and favorite player for a long time. We'll miss his clutch ability in the playoffs and presence on the power play. Wish him nothing but the best. You said it very well. This is a guy who is amongst the best Rangers ever in the playoffs. I want to pull up the graphic I made yesterday. In the playoffs, second most games played, most goals, third most points, most power play goals, tied for shorthanded goals, first in game-winning goals in the playoffs. This is undoubtedly one of the Rangers' best playoff performers in the history of their franchise. He's right there with Mark Messier, with Adam Graves, with Brian Leetch. Of course, contextually a little different, the early 90s, a little more offense. Of course, that team won, which helps. So, is this better? Chris Kreider still has 25 goal season left in him. I agree with you. I think Chris Kreider is a good candidate to score 20 to 30 goals next year on a Ducks team where he'll play more minutes. He won't really have to worry about defense because the team's going to be bad at large, and it'll give him an opportunity to really just focus on counting stats. And I don't want to say stat padding, but I do think that matters. Steven Leo Grande said, Morgan also said, get busy living or get busy dying. He was good, never great, never played to his size. Thought he was going to be the quintessential power forward, disappointed, wish him well. Steven, you echoed my sentiments. I said that earlier. He was always going to be tantalizing. You could see the projection, but he never really got there other than that 21-22 season. It's a real quandary, and it really begs the question of what really matters. Do you want the memories or do you want the championship? So don't sleep on the Ducks. Hired a real coach, veteran presence. It's not implausible the Ducks hang around this year. Dostal being a good goalie very much helps them and gives them some legitimacy. If any of their young guys like Senecki, McTavish, even Zegras take a step, it's not implausible they could hang around and be a fringe playoff team. Charles Ferris says, Soucy and Urho have to go, trade Miller, keep Zach Jones for third pair, PMD, and get 2 left-handed D to complete top 4. I agree with you. I don't particularly like Soucy. I don't particularly like Vakanainen, but I do think we're probably stuck with at least one of them. If Vakanainen's the 7th defenseman, that's different. I know we've seen conjecture that Soucy might be available in a trade as far as right now, but we'll see. I don't know. Mike D'Amico, I'm happy Drury's starting to do what he said he was going to do. More moves needed, obviously, in getting the cap space. But that's the thing that sucks about this, man. They're trading a franchise, one of the better players in the history of this team, for cap space. It would be one thing if this trade was last year or the year before and they were getting a roster player in return. If the Rangers did like a bootleg version of the Matthew Tkachuk trade where they traded Chris Kreider for, I don't know, Teuvo Teravainen 2 years ago. I'm not saying that's better, but I'm saying it would feel better because right now you're probably getting a prospect and a draft pick back. And for a 25 goal guy who's one of the most important players and maybe the most successful window of Rangers hockey ever, that's a real challenge. It's really frustrating. And let's see, going to miss Kreider a ton. Wish Kreider well, gave us some exciting moments. Steven, I don't have the official details of the trade yet. I'm going to assume that it's a prospect and a pick. The pick is varied. I've heard as low as a fourth rounder. I've heard as high as like 60 something overall. Whenever the trade does come in, but we shall see. Greg says, very good player, but an even better Ranger. It does make sense. And to the normal person, that doesn't make sense. To a Ranger fan who lived through those Tom Rennie teams, who lived through those Tortorella teams, who lived through the Vigneault and the David Quinn teams, to have a guy like Kreider, a real metronome player where as he goes, the team goes, it's really a unique role to play where you last that long. Like I said, 3 life cycles, came to a contender, tore it down, and built it back up. And now we're at the point where there's an argument to be made. Perhaps you retool and reorganize. But man, a quintessential New York Ranger of this era. Always really good, flashes of great, but never consistently what we thought he could be. And that's what makes it all the more frustrating. Because you run Kreider's career again, and I know this isn't a video game, but you run Kreider's career again, there's a path where this is 2025 Cam Neely. You get a path where this is a 40-goal guy for 10 years and one of the most dominant players in the entire league. And if he adds a little more snarl and a little more bite, and you think about what he could have been, in spite of the fact he's a really good hockey player. I mean, this is a guy we're talking about that's going to probably get his number retired when all's said and done. So that makes something special. Michael Carpenter says, lecture time, smartest guy in the room, buckle up. Well, Michael, first of all, thank you for leaving a comment. Second of all, very much admitted, hockey is an academic pursuit. No one knows everything and no one will ever know anything. Your goal should be to learn as much as you can. As the game changes, you adapt. You try and learn more. You read, you listen, you watch. You try and adapt what you watch into something translatable and relatable and digestible. Because ultimately, I try and explain things in a way that even if I don't agree with them, I can understand them. And that's really my key here. At face value, salary dumping an all-time franchise legend is really, really depressing. At the same time, 3 weeks ago, Andrew and I made really strong arguments that this is the first step in righting roster problems, because though Kreider is probably going to score 20 to 30 goals next year for the Ducks, they need that money. They need to pay Will Cooley. They need to pay Keandre Miller. They probably need another top 6 forward now. Without that money, they would have been in a really difficult position going forward financially. And there's no good answer here. If they had traded him last year after losing in the conference final, the year before that, losing against the Devils, you probably could have gotten a better return. You probably could have gotten a hockey trade done. You could have turned him into Blake Coleman in a draft pick. You could have turned him into Brock Besser and something else. You know, there was a hockey trade to be made at some point in the last 2 years, or 3 years, frankly, if you want to go back even to the year they lost to Tampa Bay. So Zachary says, love Kreider in his career here when he entered the league, and specifically remembered the Ottawa series loss. He has had a gear he can tap into, and Ridley did it over his entire tenure. I agree wholeheartedly, Zach. I think about 2017. I think about Game 6 against Ottawa. I was there. I was stone sober. I was on the verge of a panic attack. I had a stomach ache all day, how anxious I was. I worked a softball game that day, actually, for the student newspaper, and walked from the game with my jersey in my hands to the train at Stony Brook, went to the game, watched them lose, and I remember that game ending, me sitting there for a good 5 to 10 minutes, and the usher came down and was like, hey, man, you got to get up. You got to start walking out. And I was like, yeah, I know. But I knew from that moment on it wasn't going to be the same. I knew after they lost to that Ottawa team. And that Ottawa game, that Game 6, is some of the best hockey I have ever seen Zibanejad or Kreider play, and they lost. And that's really the quandary. And I know I keep saying quandary, conundrum, problem. He was always so good. But when they needed him to be great, other than that Game 6 against Carolina, never really got there. Christopher Big Bear, I hate this as a Kreider fan. That's the opinion. This is the take. This is the distilled, like, if you only have 5 minutes to pop into the stream while you're supposed to be working, I hate this. as someone who has a Kreider jersey in the closet behind them, I understand this is a need. They need the cap space. It sucks. It's a straight up salary dump, but man, they needed to do this, and it really does stink. Nick Vitale says, another great cap move by Drury, but it means nothing if they waste it with bad moves and contracts. This is the thing. This is what I have said for 2-3 weeks now. Another great move for the cap. Hell, they got out of $11 million of cap space in the last 12 months. They got out Trouba and Gaudreau, almost $12 million. And they spent it on JT Miller, so sure, Vakanainen, Parsonen, Susi, and they still need contracts for Cooley, Miller, and they need another top 6 forward. And as we keep going, Chris says, if this deal means a shot at Robbo, meaning Jason Robertson, it's amazing. If this deal means Gavrikov, Marchand, dear God, no. Chris, my brother, I'll talk to you later. I don't know. It's hard to read the tea leaves, what Chris Drury's going to do here. And at face value, Jason Robertson checks a lot of boxes, former 100-point winger. He's big. He's American. Decent chance he cracks at least the initial list for the Olympic team. But man, I really don't know. I mean, what's your Jason Robertson package look like? Lafreniere, Perreault, Schneider, and a draft pick? I mean, I would do that. I don't think Chris Drury would do that. I would. That's getting a player like Robertson, who's only 24 years old and has a higher ceiling to get to. That's the type of swing, that's the Rangers version of the Matthew Tkachuk trade, is going to get someone of that Jason Robertson age cohort, somebody between the ages of 22 and 25. And you do that, it puts you in a position where you have multiple kicks at the can, and Panarin leaves after next year, and you start to orient the team around Robertson and Fox and Shesterkin, K'Andre Miller, JT Miller, Will Cooley. And I don't know how much of an improvement Robertson would be as a Ranger. I don't know if he necessarily fits stylistically, but let's see. I agree with Chris Kreider's speed. He should have been more dynamic. Very much so. One of the real funny parts of his toolbox is he's such a great straight line skater, but he didn't really use it a whole lot. The most you saw it the last few years was on the penalty kill, was creating shorthanded chances, but not so much at 5-on-5. And some of that was a byproduct of the Rangers' inefficiency in the defensive zone, their struggles to break out going from defense to offense. Let's see. N712 Hockey says, this is opening the floodgates. K'Andre will go, and I've been led to believe Trocheck knows his time may be up by the draft. I don't think Trocheck's on the table here because he's such a quintessential Drury guy. And look, I don't think anyone should be off the table. I go back and forth on this, but if Wayne Gretzky can be traded twice, no one is untouchable in this league. I don't think you'll see the Rangers trade Trocheck, Panarin, JT Miller, Shesterkin, or Fox. Of those guys, Trocheck I could see, and some of that might be a byproduct of just not being able to move Zibanejad because Zibanejad's contract is a little more ironclad and his value's a little bit lower, whereas Trocheck, you retain some salary on him, even though he's got, I want to say, 3 more years on his deal. You can really get something tantalizing for Trocheck. And let's see, Johnny Red, I'm a fan of this team since 1992. I like Kreider, but I must admit he was consistently inconsistent. If I ever write a book about Chris Kreider, that would be the title. Consistently inconsistent. A really good player, but never someone who was in that conversation for best in the world. And again, that ties really emblematically into what the Rangers have been at large during this window. The fact that they went to so many conference finals, they only went to the one cup final. The one cup final they get to, they lose 3 games in overtime and 2 of them in double overtime. And it's really a confounding problem. And let's see, N712 Hockey says, trade sounds like Carey, Terrence, and a 4th to NYR for Kreider and a 4th. A salary dump. It's really frustrating, and it sucks to see a really good player go in what is effectively a balance sheet maneuver. If you sold a house, never lived in it, but you bought a house, you fixed it up and sold it without ever living in it, that type of deal. That's what this feels like. It's not a great feeling. And Steve says, brother, I go back to the Fred Shiro days, so I've seen and suffered, seen it all. Name on the back is never more important than the name on the front. Of course not. But we do have to have our feelings. We do have to have empathy to some degree. I'm not saying you need to love everyone on the team. I sure as hell don't. But I feel for this. This was supposed to be it. I can picture coming back to this exact seat after they lost to Florida in Game 6 last year and saying it wasn't supposed to be like this. It wasn't. Last year was the last best hope for this group, and they had a chance. They lost all of those one-goal games. They lost the one Game 5 I went to where they had a golden opportunity to win that game but couldn't get anything going offensively. And now we enter the great unknown, and that's the punishment for failure and mistakes. Is you have to pay the piper. You have to go in a certain direction and make something happen. So let's see. Drury has to start taking swings. His team isn't good enough as constructed. I agree with you wholeheartedly. That's been my biggest critique of Drury. He says we're a Stanley Cup contender, but has largely kept the same team up until this year. Coming into last year, the only guys on the team that he brought in were Trocheck, Riley Smith, Eric Gustafson, Blake Wheeler, Jonathan Quick, Sam Carrick. I mean, he had effectively the same 5 or 6 defensemen all 3 years. 5, I would say. That third left-hand D definitely rotated between Nemeth, Harper, Justin Braun. Who am I forgetting? Gustafson, who I just said. You brought in Chad Ruedel, who I forgot there. But not a lot of action until this year, where you get a lot more. And you keep going. N712 Hockey says Zibanejad may waive now, but as reported yesterday, teams have told the Rangers their staff doesn't believe his contract and will require big incentives. Yeah. Zibanejad's under contract till like 2030, 2031, and I really struggle to envision a team wanting to take on that salary commitment for a guy who's effectively a worse version of Matt Duchene at this point. I mean, Matt Duchene was a point-per-game player this year as a supporting cast player. And look, the Rangers ask more of Zibanejad than the Stars do of Duchene. But, man, it is hard to see a world where this Zibanejad deal goes well going forward. So, here's my issue. It's a cap move. There are rumors they'll sign Gavrikov and Orlov. Yeah, the Rangers, even if they add Gavrikov and Orlov to next year's team, irrespective of the fact that they have Miller under contract, they have Soucy, they have Vakanainen, they already have they have to sign Miller as an RFA and Zach Jones as an RFA. They do have to take care of that, but they already have 6 defensemen under contract. I should say they have 7 defensemen under team control. They have 5 under contract. If they trade Miller and just replace him with Orlov, who frankly isn't even better than Miller, or at least isn't projectable as better as Miller, that'd be really disappointing. To tie up 3 years in a guy who's not even as good as the guy you could have for another 3 or 4 years, that would be disappointing. And Gavrikov, I'm very weary of him outside of that LA system where LA plays arguably the best team defense in the entire NHL, whereas the Rangers, I don't know if they know defense is a team effort, so I do think that's a real question. Greg says, will he last long enough in the league to come back after his contract up, after we had Wheeler on the top line? I feel like anything is possible. Probably not. And I would say that's more of a personal decision as opposed to a team one. Is there a world where Chris Kreider wants to do the Jason Spezza in Toronto stuff where it's $800K to play year to year? Maybe. I don't think so. I think Kreider strikes me as a pretty introspective guy who's pretty self-aware and knowledgeable and speaks very well. So I think that's a guy who's going to want to either pursue a championship or whatever the next stage of his life is going to be. I'm pretty sure he's married now. I'm pretty sure he has a kid. I'm not positive about that, but at a certain point, it doesn't become about the hockey decisions anymore. And moving across the country at this stage in your life, he's 33, 34 years old, with a partner, with a child, I think. That's a real major life choice. And look, I understand the cynical view of he's going to go to Southern California. He's going to spend every day in 65 to 80 degrees. He's going to enjoy the sunshine. He's going to put up good stats. At the same time, everybody who's ever picked up a hockey stick or put on a pair of skates has dreamed about lifting a Stanley Cup. The Ducks will not be lifting a Stanley Cup in the next 2 years. They won't. I can declaratively say that. They need too much. And if Kreider wants to win a championship and he wants to year hop around between teams like Dallas and Florida and Minnesota and Vegas, sure. The only thing that would truly hurt would be if Kreider ended up somewhere like Carolina, where if he ended up somewhere like Philly or Pittsburgh or Washington, that would actually hurt. That would feel like getting stabbed in the heart. Will Screedia says, how are the Rangers going to be better? Okay, so the my answer is probably different from Chris Drury's answer, but my supposition is the power play gets 5% better. That gets them enough goals to be in the conversation as a serious playoff team. They hope better team defense, whether that's Gavrikov or Orlov or Keandre Miller regressing positively, slightly better defense. They go from bottom 5 to bottom 10. That gets you firmly in the playoff conversation. And then you're hoping for a swing. What the swing is, your guess is as good as mine. Whether it's Bennett, it's Marchand. If it were Jason Robertson, okay, you can talk me into the Rangers being better next year. But the argument for the Rangers being better is mostly based on the guys who are here just being better next year. You know, Shesterkin, 2 or 3% better save percentage. Zibanejad, a little more shooting luck. The power play a little bit better. Trocheck and Lafreniere not being actively bad defensively. The first power play getting better. Lafreniere maybe takes a step. Will Cooley takes a step. But I don't know how they get better linearly. And improvements wise, there's an argument to be made. They might make the team worse with the guys they bring in, if it's Gavrikov, if it's Orlov. So it's a fair question, but I think a lot of it is just banking on the guys who are here already being better. You know, a full year of JT Miller, Adam Fox, another year removed from that knee injury. That's your hope. St. Louis gets Zibanejad, no retention, and a 26 first, 27 second, and third for Schneider. I think that's too much for what Zibanejad is. I don't know what the going rate for salary retention space in the NHL is. I mean, Marlowe was what, $7 million from the Leafs, and Carolina took 1 first. So maybe something like this would be good enough. I mean, St. Louis is the right type of team to target. Maybe Utah, maybe Minnesota, but at the same time, Zibanejad makes a lot of money, and you don't really want teams aren't going to want to take on that deal unless they really get a good sweetener. And I don't think there's a world where they can realistically get Zibanejad out of here, barring something weird, because we know it's been reported. They asked him in season about Vancouver as potentially being part of the JT Miller trade. And there's a lot of Swedes on that Canucks team. I could see the vision from Drury trying to sell it to that Canucks consortium. What is it? Patrick Alvin's their GM. I could see a world where that's conceivable. But if he doesn't want to go, he doesn't have to go. And the Rangers can make this awkward as can be. They can very much make this a case of, okay, you want to stay, fine, but we're going to make it miserable until you want to leave, which wouldn't be a good look, but it's not out of the question. I mean, they did do it to Trouba last year. Would I do that to get rid of Zibanejad? That feels a little rich, because if we're trying to move Zibanejad, we need assets to make trades. And if you want to put Schneider and a pick into something to get something better, you know, level up those assets, yes. But just to get rid of a player who, you know, even as annoying and frustrating as Zibanejad is, he'll be good for 70 points next year. He'll be the trigger man on the first power play again. So that's something to consider as well. And that's also a good point, Will. The Rangers won't have that 26 first. Most likely, they're going to use this year's first round pick either in a trade or actually make the selection. So next year's first is off the board. Charles Ferris, for me, it was 23. Added Kane and Tarasenko. Best team in my life. Shit kinked New Jersey 5-1, 1-2. Really expected a cup run, and the team looked completely lost. I think that team was a little too confident in itself. I still think about how at the start of that season, we had Sam Rosen on the show, and we asked him what was different about the Rangers from the year before. And he said, everybody was walking around with their chest puffed out, excited. Like, can we just get to the playoffs already before the season started? And they dicked around for 50 games, and they were pretty good for like 10 games after they acquired Kane and Tarasenko, but they never really got to their potential. The defense broke down. And most importantly, most notably, New Jersey was just faster. New Jersey won a lot of loose pucks, and they got going downhill on the Rangers. And the transition issues that were present in that Tampa Bay series and the Florida series were very present there. And New Jersey just outskated the Rangers and wore them down over 7 games. Johnny Red says he gave us some great memories in the Game 6. Oh, of course. The Game 6 against Carolina is his best moment as a Ranger. And I know he's got some other remarkable ones. He's got some other important roles, but this is that's one of the best playoff performances ever. I think Messier's game 6 against the Devils, the we will win game, is the single best Rangers performance of all time. But this is up there. Lundqvist game 7 against Pittsburgh in 2014. I think that game is up there as well. But Kreider in 24 against Carolina game 6 is undoubtedly NYR for life. This team is not even close to being a contender. Outside of Fox, none of this defenseman would be alive. NYR for life, my friend. You're preaching to the choir. This has been my biggest talking point since the season ended. They are keeping the entire defensive core from a team that missed the playoffs, that was actively worse after adding JT Miller and adding Carson Soucy, who were supposed to help. So I struggle to envision, unless you think Mike Sullivan, and look, I think Mike Sullivan's still a decent NHL coach. I don't know if he's going to be able to extract. You got to remember, man, those Penguin teams, their defenses were pretty good. You had Letang, you had Dumoulin, and one of the best first pairs of the 2010s. It's hard to imagine a world where the Rangers are going to get better just on coaching. In a hard cap league, trade players sooner to get good young kids, and we traded. Yep, this is exactly what I had said at the start. Towards the beginning of the stream, I had asked, I had said if the Rangers could have found a way to trade Kreider for a younger player like last year, year before, this doesn't feel as much of a gut punch. The fact this is a straight up salary dump, that's why this hurts. That's why this is upsetting. So Michael Steinberg says, what happened to the defenseman? I assume you're talking about EJ Emery. He's probably a year away from being NHL ready. He's a right-handed shot, if I remember correctly. Defense only, not a lot of puck skills to speak of. I could see a world where he's on the team next year. I don't think he's going to be in the cards this year. If they're a playoff team and his college season ends early, maybe he jumps in. But we know NHL teams are very reticent to put inexperienced defensemen in the lineup. I remember, I want to say 2 years ago, maybe, when Colorado won the Stanley Cup, they were like the first team in the last 10, 15 years to have two defensemen under the age of 22 in their team and win the Stanley Cup. I think it was Byram and Makar were both under 22 on that team. So EJ Emery is on my radar, but he's more in that Othman-Perreault cohort of probably 2 years away from being seriously impactful. I think there's a world where Perreault and Othman are useful this year and, 10, 15 goals, flashes of excitement. But Emery, I would say, is in that category. I think Emery helps with whatever the next version of the Rangers are, not so much this one. Hockey Dad 65. I will say the Rangers D need changes. Miller needs to go as well as Fox and his mistake of a contract. Neither play D and Fox is being paid. Okay. If you want to trade Miller, and you can get something similar back. If you could do Miller for Byram or Miller for Marco Rossi or something in that range where you're getting another player in that age group, sure. I think as far as Fox goes, I think if you want to trade Adam Fox, you are saying this team needs to start over effectively. And if you want to make that argument, I am not disillusioned to the idea. You could convince me starting over entirely is the way to go here. Clear up space. You get Fox off the books. You get Panarin off the books. That's $20 million right there. And then next summer, Eichel, McDavid, etc. It's not the craziest idea. I just don't think that's something Chris Drury would do because he took this job on the premise he could push this team over the finish line. He could get this team from rebuilding to Stanley Cup, and trading away the team's best defenseman and arguably best skater is not something conducive with winning. The D-men were drafted last year, had a really rough season, didn't make the U.S. team. Yeah, you got to hope Emery bounces back and has a better second year. How would I feel if it was Gavrikov, Fox, Dumoulin, Schneider, Jones, Borgen? Okay. Skill sets wise, yes. This is the ideal skill sets. You want Fox to have a big lumbering guy with him who can move a little bit to eat hits on the forecheck, recover pucks, and get him the puck. Dumoulin, I think, is a little too old to be a second pair guy. I think if he were the third pair with Borgen, you could maybe talk me into that. But this also, Charles, unfortunately, this doesn't account for Vakanainen. This doesn't account for Carson Soucy. If they can get rid of one or both of those guys and they were looking at this, yeah, then I think we could have that conversation as far as Dumoulin as a stopgap third pair lefty and maybe something along the lines of bringing Jones back. And I've always liked Zach Jones. I haven't felt like the Rangers have given him the fairest of shakes in opportunities. From LeBron, Casey Terrence goes to Rangers, part of this trade. 4th round pick, Rangers get a 3rd. Thank you for the memories, Chris Kreider. You're worth a 3rd round pick. That's a really tough one, man. I hope this doesn't sour things. I hope the Rangers can find a way to make this amicable. Is this better? Zib's a usable part. I feel like if he plays the... If Zibanejad basically does the late career Steven Stamkos and just moves to the wing full time, I think there's a world where he's perfectly functional as JT Miller's facilitator. I don't know if you want to pay a first line right wing what he's getting paid, but as the cap goes up, it becomes more palatable. I assume Zibanejad's going to be here next year. Is the MSL game winner against the Habs is number 3 all-time moments. It's the best hockey game I've ever been to. I still can't believe it. I can still vividly remember it was Memorial Day weekend. I have the physical ticket somewhere in my room because that's back when you actually had to print out physical tickets. If I remember correctly, I put that in a picture frame and had that on my wall at one point. But that's probably the favorite I've been to. I think as far as single game performances, I don't know where I would contextualize that in terms of single torches. NYR for Life says, I would start over. However, I personally believe that when Drury handed out the no movement clause to Igor, solidified the faith of the Rangers. Yep. And this is the take. Andrew and I said that throughout the entirety of the fall last year. If you want to start over, you trade Shesterkin, you don't give him the contract, and we're going to build from the ground up. If you wanted to do that, I would have signed up for that. Because if it's an executable plan and has a vision, by all means. True or false? The Rangers have a better season in 25-26 than 24-25. So, talent-wise, I think there's an argument the roster will be worse when we start the season in the fall. It depends what they do. If they add Jason Robertson, which I'm not saying they are, but it's not out of the question. If they add Marco Rossi, if they improve the defense, math-wise, I would say yes. Math-wise, I would say true. The Rangers will be better because their power play won't be bottom 5 again. Their defense won't be bottom 5 again. I think if they get the defense to bottom 10 and the power play like 10th, that's enough to improve this team to get them back in the playoffs and by default, definition, make them better. I want to thank everyone that popped into the stream at various points throughout the last hour. I do need to wrap up. I do have a lot to get done today. So I want to thank everyone that popped in. Be sure to check out Liberty Blue on Monday, where Andrew and I will have a bit more of an introspective conversation back and forth as opposed to me using this as a stream of consciousness to get out some of my thoughts. But Chris Kreider, a quintessential New York Ranger, someone who always gave you the tantalizing prospect of being special, of being great, but only being very good. And there's no better encapsulation of the Rangers over the last 15 years than a player who's really good, but never great. Kreider probably gets his number retired when all is said and done. I wouldn't bet on it because it depends, but thank you to everyone who stopped by. I will talk to you guys with Andrew on Monday. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast wherever you get your podcasts or over on YouTube. I will probably upload this stream as an audio or a video podcast form just for people who are obviously busy. It is the middle of a workday, but